December 15th, 1946, the Palace of Justice, Nuremberg, Germany. 23 defendants sit in the dock, most wearing dark suits and ties. They look distinguished, professional. Several hold advanced degrees. One published extensively in surgical journals. Another lectured at Berlin's Charité Hospital. A third earned commendations for pioneering trauma techniques. Tomorrow, prosecutors will present evidence that transforms these accomplished physicians into defendants in a murder trial. Not for combat casualties, not for collateral damage in bombing raids, for surgery, for deliberately infecting healthy women with bacteria, and then mutilating their legs to study wound infections. And here's what makes this case different from every other Nazi atrocity prosecuted at Nuremberg. These doctors kept victims alive. They performed their experiments over months, sometimes years. They saw the same women repeatedly, watched their suffering compound, documented every stage of deterioration, and in the courtroom, those women will testify in person. 15 Polish survivors will stand before the tribunal, roll up their sleeves, and show the judges scars that make the crime undeniable. Scars that destroy every defense argument. Scars that prove these weren't emergency battlefield surgeries or desperate attempts to save lives. These were calculated systematic experiments designed to test the limits of human tissue damage and regeneration, using prisoners as living laboratories. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened at Ravensbrück concentration camp between 1942 and 1943, how 74 women became subjects in experiments they never consented to, how prosecutors tracked down survivors scattered across post-war Poland, and how the moment those women revealed their wounds in court, the defense collapsed completely. Because this isn't just about individual guilt. This is about the moment international law decided that medicine has absolute boundaries, that no military emergency justifies using human beings as experimental material, and that violating those boundaries makes you a war criminal regardless of your credentials. The question isn't whether crimes occurred. The physical evidence, the living testimony, makes that impossible to deny. The question is how men trained to heal convinced themselves that cutting into healthy prisoners was research, not torture. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why those 15 women, standing in a Nuremberg courtroom showing their scars, changed medical ethics forever. But first, we need to go back to May 1945, to the moment investigators arrived at Ravensbrück and started piecing together what happened there. Before we get into it, if you're interested in detailed historical analysis of World War II war crimes, examining primary trial evidence and the legal decisions that created modern human rights protections, I'd appreciate you hitting that subscribe button. It tells me you want more deep dive content like this, and it helps the channel grow. And as we go through this story, I want you to think about a question. Drop your answer in the comments. Where's the line between necessary medical research and human experimentation? What makes consent essential? I read every comment, and I genuinely want to know what you think. All right, let's go. Soviet forces liberate Ravensbrück women's concentration camp north of Berlin. They find skeletal prisoners, mass graves, evidence of systematic killings, standard horrors for a Nazi camp in 1945. But as Red Army investigators begin interviewing survivors, a pattern emerges. Multiple women, all Polish political prisoners, report being taken to the camp hospital, operated on without explanation, and left with permanent disabilities. They describe forced surgeries, legs cut open, bones removed, infections deliberately introduced. They describe being held in the medical block for weeks, sometimes months, while doctors monitored their deteriorating condition. They describe watching other women die from infections that spread unchecked, from surgeries that went deliberately wrong, from complications doctors observed but never treated. The Soviet investigators document these claims, but the chaos of collapsing Germany makes follow-up difficult. Survivors scatter. Many return to Poland. Some are too sick to travel. A few die shortly after liberation from complications of their wartime injuries. The evidence exists, but it's fragmentary. Testimony without documentation. Claims without corroboration. Then, in late 1945, American prosecutors preparing for the upcoming medical trial receive a tip. A former Ravensbrück prisoner now living in Warsaw has kept records. Names, dates, details of experiments conducted on Polish women. The source is credible, the information specific. Prosecutors dispatch investigators to Poland. What they find is a network of survivors who have stayed in contact, women who endured the same procedures, who witnessed each other's suffering, who kept mental records because they knew, even during the experiments, that documentation would matter. These women can name the doctors. They can describe the procedures. They can corroborate each other's accounts. And most importantly, they still carry the physical evidence, scars that haven't healed. Shortened limbs, chronic pain from poorly repaired bone damage. The investigators realize they have something prosecutors need. Living witnesses, verifiable injuries, a paper trail connecting senior SS medical officers to specific experiments. This isn't relying on liberator testimony or captured documents alone. This is victims who can stand in court and show the judges what was done to them. But first, prosecutors need to understand the context. What were these experiments supposed to accomplish? Who authorized them? And how did doctors justify systematically injuring healthy prisoners? The official justification sounded almost reasonable. German soldiers on the Eastern Front were suffering battlefield wounds that became infected. Sulfonamide drugs, the precursor to modern antibiotics, showed promise treating bacterial infections. But battlefield conditions were chaotic. Wounds were contaminated with dirt, shrapnel, fabric from torn uniforms. Military doctors needed to know which sulfonamide compounds worked best under combat conditions, how quickly infections spread in contaminated wounds, what dosage levels were effective, how to prevent gangrene when surgical facilities weren't immediately available. Legitimate research questions, questions that, answered properly, could save thousands of soldiers' lives, questions that medical science in every warring nation was trying to answer. But here's the problem, the ethical line that separates research from atrocity. Answering those questions requires studying infected wounds. In legitimate medical research, you study soldiers already wounded in combat. You treat them with different protocols and compare outcomes. You observe natural infections and test treatments. You work within the constraints of battlefield medicine to find solutions that work in real conditions. What you don't do is create the wounds yourself. And that's exactly what happened at Ravensbrück. Between July 1942 and August 1943, SS doctors selected 74 Polish women from the camp population. These weren't wounded soldiers. They were healthy prisoners, political detainees arrested for resistance activities, for hiding Jews, for distributing anti-Nazi literature. They were teachers, students, nurses, farm workers, young women, most in their 20s and 30s, in relatively good health despite camp conditions. The experiments required healthy subjects because the doctors needed to control variables. They needed to create standardized wounds, introduce specific bacterial strains, measure infection progression in otherwise healthy tissue. Battlefield wounds were too chaotic, too contaminated with unknown factors. What they wanted was laboratory conditions, clean baseline data, controlled experiments. Except their laboratory was a concentration camp barracks, and their experimental subjects were prisoners who had no idea what was about to happen to them. Let me introduce you to the doctors who designed this, not cartoon villains, not sadistic camp guards. Credentialed physicians who convinced themselves this was legitimate wartime research. Dr. Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the SS, personal physician to Heinrich Himmler. Before the war, Gebhardt was a respected orthopedic surgeon. He ran a prestigious clinic at Hohenleuken. He published papers on sports medicine. He treated German Olympic athletes. By 1942, he was one of the most powerful medical figures in the SS hierarchy, and he had a problem. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the highest-ranking SS officers, architect of the Holocaust, had been assassinated in Prague in May 1942. Heydrich was wounded by a grenade, survived the initial attack, but died days later from infection. Gebhardt had overseen his treatment. Gebhardt had chosen not to use sulfonamide drugs aggressively. When Heydrich died, whispers began. Had Gebhardt's conservative treatment contributed to the death? Should sulfonamides have been used more aggressively? Gebhardt needed to prove his treatment decisions were correct. He needed to demonstrate that sulfonamides weren't the miracle cure some physicians claimed. He needed experimental evidence showing that wound infections followed predictable patterns regardless of drug intervention, and he had access to something most researchers didn't: unlimited human subjects who couldn't refuse. Working with Gebhardt were Dr. Fritz Fischer, his assistant, a surgeon in his own right, ambitious, eager to advance his career, and Dr. Herta Oberhäuser, one of the few female SS physicians, a dermatologist by training, who took an active role in the experimental procedures. Together, these three doctors designed a series of experiments that would systematically injure prisoners, infect their wounds with bacteria, and test whether sulfonamide drugs could prevent the resulting infections. Here's how the experiments worked, step by step, procedure by procedure, documented in trial records and survivor testimony. Women were selected from the Polish political prisoner bloc. They were told they were being transferred for work assignments. They were marched to the camp hospital. Once there, they were examined, their general health assessed, and then they were told what was actually happening. They were going to undergo surgery for the good of German soldiers, to help develop better treatments for battlefield wounds. Some women protested, some refused outright. It made no difference. This wasn't a request. Guards were present. Refusal meant immediate punishment, possibly execution. Several women who resisted were beaten, dragged to the operating theater, and held down. The procedures were conducted in the camp's surgical facility, a converted barracks equipped with operating tables, anesthesia equipment, surgical instruments. Everything you'd find in a normal hospital except for one thing: patient consent forms. The women were anesthetized, usually with local anesthesia, sometimes with general. Then the doctors made incisions in their legs, typically the calf or thigh. The incisions were deep, cutting through muscle tissue down to the bone. In some cases, doctors removed sections of bone. In others, they cut away muscle tissue. The goal was to create a wound that simulated battlefield trauma, a severe injury with significant tissue damage. Then came the infection phase. Doctors introduced bacteria into the open wounds: streptococcus, staphylococcus, gas gangrene bacteria. They also introduced foreign material: wood splinters, glass fragments, dirt, material designed to mimic battlefield contamination. They wanted to recreate the conditions of an infected combat wound as closely as possible. Then they closed the wounds, sometimes with sutures, sometimes leaving them partially open, and they waited. They monitored the women over the following days and weeks, watching for signs of infection, fever, inflammation, tissue necrosis. They measured how quickly infections developed. They documented the progression of gangrene. They tested different sulfonamide compounds at different dosages, comparing infection rates between treated and untreated subjects. Some women received sulfonamide treatment immediately. Some received it after infections had already taken hold. Some received no treatment at all. They were the control group, left to see what happened when battlefield wounds went completely untreated. The suffering was extraordinary. Women developed raging infections. Fevers spiked to life-threatening levels. Wounds suppurated, oozing pus, turning gangrenous. The smell in the medical block was overwhelming, flesh rotting while the women were still alive. Some women became delirious. Some begged for treatment. Some simply endured, knowing that showing weakness might get them killed. Several women died. Infections spread beyond the wound sites. Sepsis set in, organs failed. The doctors documented everything: cause of death, infection progression, bacterial cultures taken from the wounds, autopsy findings showing how thoroughly the infections had ravaged their bodies. The survivors carried permanent damage: shortened legs where bone had been removed, muscle atrophy where tissue had been excised, chronic pain from nerve damage, scars that would never fully heal, disabilities that would last the rest of their lives. And the doctors took notes throughout. Clinical observations, data tables, photographs of the wounds at various stages of infection. They treated this like any other medical research. They discussed findings in staff meetings. They debated methodology. They refined their procedures based on results from earlier subjects. Dr. Gebhardt even presented preliminary findings at a medical conference in May 1943 at the Third Eastern Meeting of Consulting Surgeons of the Wehrmacht in Berlin. He described experiments testing sulfonamide efficacy. He didn't explicitly say the subjects were concentration camp prisoners, but he described conditions that no ethical research could produce: severe infections, untreated controls, mortality rates that no volunteer study would ever permit. Other doctors in attendance asked questions. Some requested more detailed data. No one objected. No one reported it. Because by 1943, within certain circles of German military medicine, using camp prisoners for experiments had become normalized. But here's what those doctors didn't understand in 1942 and 1943. Every procedure they documented, every photograph they took, every conference presentation they delivered was building evidence that would survive the Third Reich. When Germany collapsed, those documents didn't disappear. They were captured by Allied forces, filed in military archives, cross-referenced with camp records, matched to survivor testimony. And in 1946, when prosecutors began preparing the medical trial at Nuremberg, they had something extraordinary: complete documentation of the crimes written by the criminals themselves. By autumn 1945, investigators had assembled enough evidence to move forward. They had the paper trail showing who authorized the experiments. They had Gebhardt's correspondence with Himmler. They had requisition forms for surgical equipment sent to Ravensbrück. They had conference papers describing the research. They had autopsy reports on women who died. But they also had something more powerful. They had survivors. 74 women were subjected to these experiments. 6 died during or shortly after the procedures. 5 more died before the war ended from complications. That left 63 survivors scattered across Poland, and prosecutors needed to find them. The search took months. Investigators worked with Polish authorities, tracking down former Ravensbrück prisoners through resistance networks, through Red Cross registries, through parish records in small towns where women had returned after liberation. Slowly, they built a list: names, current addresses, medical conditions, willingness to testify. Many women were terrified. They had survived the camps. They had rebuilt their lives. The idea of returning to Germany, of facing their torturers in court, of reliving the trauma was overwhelming. But others were determined. They wanted justice. They wanted the world to know what had been done to them. They wanted those doctors held accountable. By mid-1946, prosecutors had identified 15 women willing to travel to Nuremberg and testify. 15 survivors who could describe the experiments in detail, corroborate each other's accounts, and most importantly, show the physical evidence, the scars that never healed, the shortened limbs, the chronic disabilities. The logistics were complex. These women were Polish citizens. Travel documents had to be arranged, medical examinations conducted to confirm they were healthy enough for the journey. translators hired, housing secured in Nuremberg, security arranged because these women were witnesses in a trial where the defendants included powerful SS officers. December 9th, 1946. The doctors' trial officially begins. 23 defendants, 20 doctors, and 3 SS administrators. The charges are extensive. War crimes and crimes against humanity for conducting medical experiments without consent, causing death, torture, and permanent injury across multiple concentration camps. The lead prosecutor, Brigadier General Telford Taylor, has a strategy. He's not going to overwhelm the judges with every atrocity. He's going to focus on specific experiments that clearly violate any conceivable ethical standard. Experiments where the evidence is irrefutable, where survivor testimony is available, where the documentation is complete. The Ravensbrück sulfonamide experiments are central to that strategy because they have everything prosecutors need. Clear documentation showing who designed and authorized them, detailed records of procedures and outcomes, and living witnesses who can testify and display their injuries in court. January 1947, prosecutors begin presenting their case. They start with the framework, explaining why medical experiments on prisoners without consent constitute war crimes, establishing that certain ethical principles transcend national law and military authority, building the legal foundation for what will become the Nuremberg Code. Then they move to specific experiments, and Ravensbrück comes early in that presentation. Prosecutors enter documents into evidence, Gebhardt's letters to Himmler proposing the experiments, approval memos from SS headquarters, requisition orders for bacteria cultures, for surgical supplies, for medications, conference papers describing the research, medical reports documenting procedures and outcomes. The judges read through page after page of clinical documentation. Descriptions of incisions, infection rates, mortality data, all written with the detached precision of scientific research. No indication that the subjects were prisoners, no mention of consent, no acknowledgement that creating wounds in healthy women might be ethically problematic. Then prosecutors call the first survivor witness. Her name is Władysława Karolewska. Though that detail is documented carefully because getting names right matters, she's 26 years old. She was arrested in 1941 for resistance activities. She was sent to Ravensbrück. In August 1942, she was selected for the experiments. She takes the stand. Through a translator, she describes being told she was going for a work assignment, being brought to the hospital, realizing, too late, what was actually happening. She describes the surgery, the pain when anesthesia wore off, the fever that followed, the infection that nearly killed her. Then the prosecutor asks her a simple question. Can you show the court your injuries? She stands. She rolls up her sleeve, and there, visible to everyone in the courtroom, are the scars, thick, irregular, discolored tissue running down her arm. Evidence of deep incisions, evidence of infection, evidence of tissue damage that healed poorly because it was never meant to heal properly in the first place. The courtroom goes absolutely silent. The judges lean forward. Even the defense attorneys, who have reviewed the documentary evidence, seem shaken because documents are abstract. Photographs can be questioned. But a living woman standing 10 feet away showing wounds that are years old but still visibly disfiguring makes the crime immediate and undeniable. Karolewska sits back down. The prosecutor continues. He asks about other women. Who else was operated on? Who survived? Who died? She names names. She describes watching friends dragged to surgery. She describes hearing screams from the operating room. She describes women who returned from procedures unable to walk, infections spreading, fevers raging, and doctors who observed but provided minimal treatment because they were testing how infections progressed without intervention. The defense attorneys begin cross-examination. They try to suggest her memory might be faulty. Years have passed. Camp conditions were chaotic. Perhaps she's mistaken about who performed the procedures or what the stated purpose was. Her response is calm and devastating. She's not mistaken. She remembers every detail. The faces of the doctors, the layout of the operating room, the other women who went through the same procedures. And if the court doubts her, there are 14 other women here who can confirm everything she's saying. Over the following days, prosecutors call more survivors. Each woman tells a similar story with individual variations, different dates, different procedures, different complications. But the pattern is identical. Healthy women selected, forced surgery, deliberate infection, minimal treatment, permanent damage, and each woman shows her scars. One by one, 15 women stand before the tribunal. 15 sets of scars, 15 accounts that corroborate each other down to the smallest details. The dates match camp records. The doctor names match personnel files. The descriptions of procedures match the clinical reports entered into evidence. The cumulative effect is overwhelming. This isn't one witness whose testimony might be questioned. This is a pattern so consistent, so well documented from both survivor accounts and German medical records, that denial becomes impossible. But the defense attorneys have to try. They represent men facing execution. They have to challenge the prosecution's narrative, find cracks in the testimony, create reasonable doubt. So they shift strategy. They don't deny the experiments happened. The evidence makes that impossible. Instead, they argue justification. Dr. Robert Servatius, defense attorney for Karl Gebhardt, stands and presents his argument. Germany was fighting a total war. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were dying from infected wounds. Medical science needed answers. The experiments, while regrettable, served a legitimate military purpose. They generated data that could save German lives. He points out that every nation conducts medical research during wartime, that battlefield medicine always involves difficult choices, that testing new treatments requires some level of risk, that the women selected were political prisoners, enemies of the state, convicted of crimes against Germany. The implication is clear. These weren't innocent civilians. These were resistance fighters, enemy combatants by another name. And in total war, using enemy prisoners for research that might save your own soldiers is a difficult choice, but not a criminal one. The prosecution's response is swift and precise. Prosecutor James McHaney stands. He doesn't shout. He doesn't appeal to emotion. He simply asks questions. Were these women soldiers? No, they were political prisoners. Were they wounded when the experiments began? No, they were healthy. Did they volunteer? No, they were forced. Did they have the option to refuse? No, refusal meant punishment or death. Were the wounds they received similar to battlefield injuries? No, they were surgically created under controlled conditions. So, McHaney continues, let's be clear about what happened. German doctors took healthy prisoners, cut into their bodies without consent, deliberately infected the wounds, and watched what happened. Some died, others suffered permanent disabilities. All endured extraordinary pain. And the justification is that this might generate useful data. McHaney then brings in expert witnesses. American and British military physicians who specialize in battlefield trauma and infection treatment. These experts review Gebhardt's experimental protocols, his published findings, his methodology. Their testimony destroys the military necessity argument. One expert, a U.S. Army surgeon with extensive combat experience, testifies that the experimental design was fundamentally flawed. Gebhardt's experiments used healthy prisoners with good nutrition, relatively speaking, and controlled surgical wounds. That's nothing like the reality of battlefield trauma. Real battlefield wounds involve massive tissue destruction, severe blood loss, shock, contamination with battlefield debris, delays in treatment while soldiers are evacuated. You can't simulate those conditions by making clean incisions in healthy prisoners and introducing bacterial cultures. The expert continues. If Germany wanted useful data on sulfonamide treatment, they had millions of actual battlefield casualties to study. They could have conducted comparative studies using wounded soldiers, testing different treatment protocols, comparing outcomes. That would have generated relevant, reliable data without torturing prisoners. Another expert witness, a British physician, points out something even more damning. Allied forces were conducting similar research during the same period, testing sulfonamide compounds and other antibacterial treatments. They used wounded soldiers who consented to experimental treatments. They used animal models for controlled experiments. They shared data through medical journals and military channels. And the Allied research produced better results, more reliable data, clearer treatment protocols, all without deliberately wounding prisoners. Which means the Ravensbrück experiments weren't just criminal, they were scientifically unnecessary. The Germans could have gotten better information through ethical research methods. The defense has no effective counterargument. Their military necessity justification collapses under the weight of expert testimony showing the experiments were poorly designed, that the data was contaminated by methodological flaws, and that ethical alternatives existed and were being used successfully by Allied medical services. So the defense tries another approach. They argue that the defendants were following orders, that Gebhardt received approval from Himmler, that military doctors don't have the authority to refuse orders from SS leadership, that the individual defendants were cogs in a machine they didn't control. This argument might work for lower-level participants, camp guards who followed orders, administrative staff who processed paperwork. But for the senior doctors, the men who designed the experiments, who wrote the protocols, who presented findings at conferences, this defense is absurd. The prosecution presents Gebhardt's correspondence with Himmler. The letters show Gebhardt proposing the experiments, not reluctantly accepting orders. The letters show him requesting resources, asking for specific numbers of subjects, describing the research as an opportunity to resolve the sulfonamide controversy. These aren't the letters of a man being coerced. These are the letters of a researcher pitching a project to a funding source. Gebhardt wanted to conduct these experiments. They served his professional interests. They let him demonstrate his theories about wound treatment. They gave him data he could publish, present at conferences, use to advance his career. And here's the detail that makes his culpability undeniable. After Heydrich's death, there was internal SS criticism of Gebhardt's treatment decisions. Whispers that maybe sulfonamides should have been used more aggressively. Gebhardt's professional reputation was at stake. He needed to prove his approach was correct, so he designed experiments specifically to generate data supporting his position. He wasn't following orders to conduct necessary military research. He was conducting experiments to vindicate his own medical judgment, using prisoners as subjects because they couldn't refuse and because their deaths would be filed as routine camp mortality. That's not following orders. That's murder in service of professional ego. The tribunal hears all of this, months of testimony, hundreds of documents, dozens of witnesses. The evidence piles up, layer after layer, until the defense's arguments are buried under the sheer weight of documentation. But the prosecution isn't finished. They've dismantled the defense's legal arguments. They've shown the experiments were unnecessary, poorly designed, and conducted for career advancement rather than military necessity. Now they're going to do something that transforms this from a legal proceeding into a moral reckoning. They're going to put all 15 Polish women in the courtroom at the same time, February 1947. The prosecution announces they're calling a group witness session, all 15 survivors together, the defense objects. This is irregular. It's prejudicial. Having all the victims present simultaneously will overwhelm the judges, make objective evaluation impossible. The judges overrule the objection. These women traveled from Poland to testify. They have a right to be heard together. Their collective testimony is relevant because it demonstrates the systematic nature of the experiments. The 15 women enter the courtroom. They sit in 2 rows in the witness section. The defendants, including Gebhardt, Fischer, and Oberhäuser, sit directly across from them. For the first time since Ravensbrück, victims and perpetrators are in the same room. The atmosphere is electric. Journalists lean forward. The judges watch carefully. Even the defense attorneys seem uncertain how to handle this moment. The prosecutor doesn't ask complex questions. He doesn't need to. He simply asks each woman to state her name, when she was arrested, when she was operated on, and what permanent injuries she carries. One by one, they answer. The pattern emerges with devastating clarity. 74 women were subjected to these experiments across a 14-month period. The procedures followed the same protocol. The outcomes were predictable: death, permanent disability, chronic pain, and the doctors documented it all with clinical detachment, never stopping to question whether any of this was justifiable. Then the prosecutor asks the question that changes everything. Will each of you please show the tribunal your injuries? 15 women stand. Some roll up sleeves, some lift pant legs, some move stiffly, their damaged legs unable to bend properly, and the scars are visible from across the courtroom: thick, raised tissue, discolored skin, muscle atrophy, bone deformities, legs shortened by inches where bone sections were removed and never properly reconstructed. The judges stare. The court stenographer stops typing for a moment. The silence is absolute. Because this isn't testimony that can be cross-examined. This isn't documentary evidence that can be questioned. This is physical proof. 15 living women carrying permanent evidence of what was done to them. Scars that are years old but still visibly severe. Disabilities that will last the rest of their lives. Karl Gebhardt, sitting in the defendant's dock, looks at the floor. He doesn't meet their eyes. Fritz Fischer shifts in his seat, uncomfortable. Herta Oberhäuser's face is expressionless. The prosecutor lets the moment hold. He doesn't rush to the next question. He lets the judges look, lets them process what they're seeing, lets the full weight of the evidence, both documentary and physical, settle over the courtroom. Then he asks one final question. Did any of you consent to these procedures? 15 voices answer, no, no, no. A chorus of refusal, of violated autonomy, of medical ethics abandoned completely. The defense has no questions. What could they possibly ask? The evidence is standing in front of them. The women sit back down, and the prosecution rests its case on the Ravensbrück experiments. They've presented documentary evidence showing who authorized the experiments and who conducted them. They've presented expert testimony, showing the experiments were scientifically unnecessary and methodologically flawed. They've presented survivor testimony describing what happened in detail. And they've presented physical evidence that makes denial impossible. Over the following weeks, the trial continues. Other experiments are presented: high-altitude experiments, freezing experiments, epidemic jaundice research, skeleton collection atrocities. The catalog of Nazi medical crimes is exhaustive and horrifying. But the Ravensbrück experiments remain central because they demonstrate something the judges need to understand. These weren't desperate measures taken in combat conditions. These weren't emergency procedures during battlefield chaos. These were planned, systematic research projects conducted over months with full documentation, presented at medical conferences, defended as legitimate science. And that's what makes them unforgivable. Because it shows how easily medicine can become torture when consent disappears, when prisoners become subjects, when doctors convince themselves that research goals justify any methodology. By summer 1947, the tribunal is deliberating. The judges face an unprecedented task. They're establishing legal principles that will govern medical research for generations. They're deciding where the line is, what medicine can never do, what no military emergency justifies. The evidence from Ravensbrück makes that line clear. When you take healthy people, injure them without consent, watch them suffer for research purposes, and document their pain as data, you've crossed from medicine into murder. The fact that you wear a white coat and use proper surgical technique doesn't change that fundamental reality. July 19th, 1947. The tribunal delivers its verdict. The courtroom is packed. The 15 Polish women are present, sitting together, waiting to hear whether their testimony mattered, whether traveling to Nuremberg and reliving their trauma achieved anything. The presiding judge reads the judgment. The language is precise, legalistic, but the moral clarity is absolute. The tribunal finds that the sulfonamide experiments at Ravensbrück constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity, that the experiments were conducted without consent, caused death and permanent injury, and served no legitimate military purpose that could possibly justify the suffering inflicted. The judgment specifically addresses the defense's arguments and systematically dismantles them. Military necessity is irrelevant when ethical research methods existed and were available. Following orders doesn't apply when the defendants proposed and designed the experiments themselves. Scientific value is negated when the methodology is so flawed that the data is unreliable. Then the tribunal makes a broader statement, one that transcends this specific case. The judges declare that certain medical ethics principles are absolute. They apply regardless of national law, military orders, or wartime conditions. That voluntary consent is not preferred or ideal when circumstances allow. It's essential, always, without exception. The judgment explains that the evidence from Ravensbrück demonstrates exactly why this principle cannot be compromised. When consent is eliminated, when prisoners become experimental subjects, medicine transforms into something unrecognizable. The entire scientific apparatus, peer review, conferences, publications, becomes corrupted by that single fundamental violation. Now comes the sentencing, the moment when legal judgment becomes concrete consequence. Karl Gebhardt, chief surgeon of the SS, architect of the Ravensbrück experiments, the man who proposed them to Himmler and designed the protocols, is sentenced to death by hanging. Fritz Fischer, his assistant, who personally conducted many of the surgeries, who selected victims and performed the procedures, death by hanging. Herta Oberheiser, who participated in the experiments and provided post-operative care while documenting suffering as clinical data, receives 20 years imprisonment, the only woman convicted at the doctor's trial. The death sentences shock some observers. Execution seems severe for medical crimes. These men didn't operate gas chambers. They didn't command death squads. They conducted experiments. Surely life imprisonment would be sufficient. But the tribunal's reasoning is deliberate and clear. These men didn't just violate medical ethics. They systematically corrupted an entire profession. They made hospitals places of terror. They turned surgical skill into a weapon. They documented their crimes with pride, intending to publish, to advance careers, to gain professional recognition for research built on screams and scars. The judgment specifically cites the Ravensbrück experiments in explaining why execution is necessary. The tribunal notes that Gebhardt conducted these experiments for nearly a year. He watched women suffer. He saw some die. He observed permanent disabilities in survivors. And he never reconsidered, never questioned whether the data was worth the human cost, never stopped. The judges conclude that some crimes are so fundamental, so destructive of basic human values, that lesser penalties would minimize their severity. That allowing these doctors to live would suggest medical torture is somehow less serious than other forms of murder. The court must send an unmistakable message that medicine has boundaries and crossing them carries ultimate consequences. But there's something else happening in that courtroom during the verdict, something that doesn't appear in the official transcripts, but witnesses remember vividly. As the sentences are read, as Gebhardt and Fischer learn they'll hang, the 15 Polish women hold hands. They don't cheer. They don't celebrate. They sit quietly, holding hands, tears running down some faces, expressions of grim satisfaction on others. Because this moment represents something beyond personal justice. It represents the world acknowledging what was done to them, believing them, taking their testimony seriously enough to execute the men responsible. One survivor later described the feeling. For years, she said, they were told their bodies belonged to the state, that they existed to serve German research, that their suffering was necessary and justified. And now in this courtroom, the judges were saying the exact opposite. Your bodies belong to you. No doctor has the right to experiment without your consent. What was done to you was murder, not medicine. That validation, that official recognition of their humanity, mattered as much as the sentences themselves. June 2nd, 1948. Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. Karl Gebhardt and Fritz Fischer are executed by hanging. The process is swift, bureaucratic, efficient. Two men who once performed surgery now climb stairs to a gallows. Their medical knowledge, their surgical skill, their academic credentials, none of it saves them. Gebhardt's last words are reportedly defiant. He claims he acted to save German lives. That history will judge him differently, that he was a patriot following his duty. History has not been kind. The executions mark a turning point, not just in law, but in the fundamental understanding of what medicine is allowed to be. The trial established principles that now govern all human subject research worldwide. Every clinical trial, every medical study, every experiment involving humans operates under ethical frameworks that trace directly back to Nuremberg. The Nuremberg Code emerges from these trials. 10 principles governing medical research. They begin with an absolute requirement stated in the opening line. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential, not recommended, not preferred when possible. Essential. Always. No exceptions. That single sentence exists because prosecutors laid photographs of Ravensbrück survivors' scars on a table in Nuremberg and forced the world to confront what medicine looks like when consent disappears. Let me show you why this matters today. Why experiments conducted in 1942 and prosecuted in 1947 still shape every interaction you have with medical science. When you participate in a clinical trial, you sign an informed consent form. That document exists because of Ravensbrück. When researchers explain risks and benefits before you agree to participate, that requirement exists because of what the judges saw when 15 women showed their scars in court. When institutional review boards evaluate research protocols before approval, that entire oversight system exists because the Nuremberg Tribunal decided medical research needs external ethical review. The principle is simple and absolute. Your body belongs to you. No doctor, regardless of credentials, regardless of how important the research, regardless of how many lives might theoretically be saved, can use your body for experiments without your informed, voluntary consent. That principle seems obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified in international law. It became law because 15 Polish women stood in a courtroom, showed wounds that hadn't healed, and proved that medicine without consent is simply torture wearing a stethoscope. The Declaration of Helsinki in 1964, the Belmont Report in 1979, modern institutional review boards, informed consent protocols, all of these protections stem from the recognition forced by the Ravensbrück evidence that certain boundaries are absolute and non-negotiable. But let's be honest about something the official histories often gloss over. Justice at Nuremberg was incomplete. 23 defendants stood trial in the doctor's case. Hundreds of other physicians participated in camp experiments, reviewed research proposals, attended conferences where criminal data was presented, and faced no consequences whatsoever. Many continued practicing medicine after the war. Some held prestigious positions. The medical profession's reckoning with its Nazi past was slow, incomplete, and often defensive. Herta Oberhäuser, sentenced to 20 years, served only 5. She opened a medical practice and worked as a family physician until survivors discovered her whereabouts and protested. Her medical license was revoked in 1958, but she practiced for 6 years after participating in criminal experiments, showing how quickly Nuremberg's lessons faded. Which brings us to the question that matters most, the question those 15 Polish women would want you to ask. How do we ensure it never happens again? Not just the dramatic extreme of Ravensbrück, but the subtle erosions of consent, the gradual compromises that happen when research pressures, career incentives, and institutional goals align against patient welfare. The Ravensbrück doctors didn't wake up one day and decide to torture prisoners. They arrived there through incremental steps. First came dehumanizing language. Prisoners became subjects, people became experimental material. Then institutional normalization, when colleagues conducted similar experiments and superiors approved them. Add career incentives, publications, and promotions for successful research. Mix in wartime emergency rhetoric justifying extreme measures. Remove external oversight, no ethics committees or independent review. That combination can transform medicine into torture. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Some of those factors exist in modern medical research, not to the same degree, but present enough that vigilance matters. Medical research today faces enormous pressure to publish, secure grants, produce results, meet enrollment targets. Those pressures create temptation to minimize informed consent procedures because they slow enrollment, to downplay risks because full disclosure might scare away subjects, to continue studies even when early data suggests harm. Institutional review boards exist to prevent those temptations from becoming violations. But ultimately, medical ethics depends on individual doctors choosing to honor consent even when violating it would be easier, faster, or more scientifically productive. Those 15 Polish women, standing in that courtroom showing their scars, were asking future doctors to make that choice, to remember that patients are people first, research subjects second, that consent isn't bureaucracy. It's the foundation of ethical medicine. So here's the question I want you to think about. If you were offered a treatment developed from unethical research, research conducted without consent that caused suffering but produced genuinely useful medical knowledge, would you accept it? Would you let doctors use that information to treat your illness? Or would you refuse on principle, even if refusal meant worse outcomes? There's no obviously correct answer, but asking the question matters because it forces you to confront the human cost of medical knowledge. What's not complicated is the principle they established. Consent is essential. Always. No exceptions. No emergencies justify abandoning it. No research goals excuse eliminating it. That principle, paid for in scars and suffering, remains the foundation of medical ethics. If this deep dive into World War II medical trials and the legal principles that emerged from them resonated with you, I'd appreciate you subscribing. This channel focuses on detailed historical analysis using primary sources and trial records, examining not just what happened, but why it matters today. And if you found value in this examination of where medical ethics boundaries come from, hit that like button. The 15 Polish women who showed their scars in Nuremberg changed medicine forever. Their courage, their willingness to relive trauma for the sake of justice, gave us the ethical frameworks that govern medical research today. Their legacy is the reminder that medicine's power to heal carries equal power to harm, and only consent, freely given and rigorously protected, prevents that power from becoming tyranny. Remember their scars. Remember what they cost. And remember that every patient carries the same fundamental right those women were denied. The right to say yes or no. The right to control what happens to their own body. The right to be treated as human beings, not experimental material. That right exists because 15 women stood in a courtroom in 1947 and showed the world what happens when it disappears. I'll see you in the next one.